selected ladies and gentlemen, to the world's largest run webinar series, World Human Sciences and Management Conference. This initiative by Center for Adivasi Research and Development, CARD, in collaboration with the Indian Institute of Management and Central University of Odisha, Koraput. Heartfelt thanks to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal and Professor uh, I. Ramabrahma and Dean Professor Sarath Kumar Palit, one genius mind and historian of the national repute, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, who represents here one leading college, Reading University, Ravenshaw, now University, and eminent logician and philanthropist Charudatta Panigrahiji, and a fine economist and policy activist of this country, who is a futurist and author of this conference. The broader theme of this series is agnotological context, disciplinary practices, and social sciences and policy frames. Today, one finest mind of this planet with us, Professor David Jacobs. This name itself need not require any introduction. He is a best political scientist, adjunct professor, American University, Washington, D.C., United States. He is a kind-hearted person without any thought accepted. Our director, Dr. Zena, invitation to speak in this high time series on business and politics in United States, oligarchy or democracy. He joined with us all the way from Washington. Friends, pandemic brought to think times and think episteme. Let's begin the cards initiation of 3D effect representing the new world order with debate, dialogue, and discussion. Promote our agenda for nature, culture, language, and identity. Without wasting time, I give special thanks to Dr. Shubham Das, Dr. Samuel Lima, Dr. Ghanashyam Giri, Dr. Aniruddha Jena, Dr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti, and Chinmay Kumar Sahu, who worked hard to make this possible. Also, welcome to all who watch through YouTube live streaming, Facebook live streaming, and live in our official website, cardodisha.org. Now, I will invite Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda for his introductory remark. Over to you, Professor Nanda.
Thank you, Rudra, for this inaugural remarks, and very warm welcome to all the viewers, and particularly good morning to Professor Jacob. And I mean, my job is just to spell out what possibly is going to harp on this evening in terms of his talk. Professor Jacob, as all of us know, that he is basically from American University, Washington, and is associated with one of the leading business schools, called Kogod School of Business at American University, and formerly he was at the Morgan State University, and his specialization being a very interesting, eclectic careers, brings in philosophical anthropology, business ethics, and labor studies, and look at the kind of areas that he thinks through. And particularly when he's going to talk to us, share his ideas which has been built up for perhaps over almost 3-4 decades on certain questions like business lobbies and these the what you call the symphony of democratic traditions in US. This is going to be very challenging and interesting, and in many ways it is going to be very critical because he's trying to tell us what really US means. If you ask someone, for most part of the world, US always is a kind of entity to which we remain beholden in terms of our wonderment, in terms of our awe, in terms of our awe and admiration, because of many reasons. As it is often said that Europe sits in our mind for the decolonized people, for the colonized people. Europe was something is a hyper-real phenomenon. Similarly, for most of the post-colonial nations also, America remains as a hyper-real, kind of entity. So, in a context like this, when Professor Jacob has agreed to talk about a theme which is absolutely timely and quite relevant in the context of the fact that we had, uh, for the last 5 years or so, in South Asia, most part of South Asia and other parts in Latin America and Asia, the usual drawing room conversation would always, at least part of it would veer around what is happening in US, what are the policies being drafted, how they are implemented, how US looks at other nations, and particularly when we had this wave of pandemic, the way Trump dealt with it, the whole question of China and everything came up, and also the way Trump was, voted out of power, and Biden now has come in. It is in this particular context when Professor Jacob has agreed to talk on a theme which is very illuminating. Now, if you look at the kind of work that he has done, it's very interesting. Starting with, one of the major theme that he has thought through is the question of ethics, business ethics, and where he tries to look at this question very differently. Even though he thinks, he specializes in an area called philosophical anthropology. So he rejects this whole, raw translation or raw application of this idea of philosophical ethics into drawing a framework for ethics as far as business is concerned. That is what makes his work very seminal, in the sense that he's trying to argue that what is important is the social consequences of individual actions. So it cannot be a kind of very straitjacket application of philosophical ethics played into your world of business. So more or less what he's trying to argue, that it has to be pragmatic ethics, and that pragmatism in business ethics is more important, where human flowering can be ensured, at the same time social consequences can be made. So that is something which is really seminal in many ways, when we have a very typical, very nuanced notion, or maybe a very normative notion of ethics, in a certain way, that it has to be really something to do with human flourishing in a certain ways. So that is one. But his major work also relates to particularly question of business lobbies and power structure. One of these famous book, and a very well reviewed book, is Business Lobbies and Power Structure in America, where he hasn't done a kind of very theoretical kind of definitely he has come up with a theoretical argument, but he tries to base his argument on the basis of evidence and 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 empirical analysis, where he has shown very clearly, right since 1990s, perhaps. I have to get into the details of the book, but as the review shows, that he's trying to argue that the business lobbies in America has been very powerful, and they have remained as a kind of very serious and they have been a kind of irritant for building up social welfare policy measures to ensure societal well-being. And he argues particularly that the unwillingness to compromise with labor and other social groups has made lobbies a barrier to policy making and a source of social injustice, quote unquote. So, in many ways, he looks at the business interest as a system of power in the US itself, as part of building up political economy in US. So that is very interesting. And also, based on these kind of arguments, he tries to argue, perhaps certainly, that it is the wealthy few in US who move policy, not the average American has much more space to articulate their views. Uh, though we know that America is one of the most celebrated democracies of the globe today, and we always try to cite example America as one of the very pro people and liberal democracies of the globe. But here Jacob thinks through America in a different way, tries to show the areas which needs much more louder thinking for the policymakers and also for the people, those who are involved with a kind of global order, which would be more pro people and more sanitized in many sense. And particularly if you try to look into the kind of existing theories which tries to tell us many things. I mean, if you want to adopt a kind of theoretical framework within which we can understand American politics, is whether we talk of majoritarian democratic electoral democracy, or elite economic elite dominance, or for that matter, whether it is majoritarian pluralism or a biased pluralism, as we saw in the preceding regime of Trump. If you take into account all these theoretical formulations, then the kind of argument that Jacob has made clearly brings out that these people, the ordinary folks, have little say, and it is the biased pluralism, it is the dominance of the economic elite that really dominates the scenario today. And finally, Jacob is interesting in also in a very unorthodox way, not unorthodox way, but he is very timely, and his thoughts are, present a very timely intervention to a situation. I mean, we have been almost living in a spree of seasons, or you say the calendrical years, which is basically stitched with an idea of pandemic. The way has come, the way it has stayed with us. We don't see any immediate possibility of getting out of it. It is in this context he looks at the business scenario and the possible fallout effect of it in the making of a democratic tradition in US, which will have a very seminal, which will have a very large across the global, on the global politics itself. So when he thinks about this question of, challenge of what is called the challenge of virtualization, and it is where he tries to looks at the challenges and prospects of this kind of system where we have to play out all our day-to-day transactions on an online mode. So what that order would be, in an online worldly order where business is done and with a new normal sentiment, how these challenges are to be made. So somebody who has had a very strong orientations in the understanding of ethics, who has very, very strong foundational, or in-depth understanding of the labor scenario and the social welfare major aspects of US, and pitted against this, when we are confronting a very new normal global order, and particularly in America, the way they are trying to deal with that crisis and how business is going to be. Because what kind of model America sets is going to be mostly and largely to be followed in many of these countries, as we know, despite the fact that we mentally resent it or not, we are part of it. So that the very engagement with these questions makes of course, Jacob very different to my mind. And the way he's, I'm sure that the way he's going to deal with these issues in the course of his theme would be really highly illuminating to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nanda, for the thought-provoking welcome remark. Now, I would like to request Mr. Charudatta Panigrahi for his introductory remark. Over to you, Professor Panigrahi.
Thank you, Rudra. Morning, Professor Jacobs. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. How are you doing?
Good,
Good
good.
evening.
Good evening. We are all fine, and we are in the middle of COVID, but there is a way out. And now I think we are vaccinated quite a lot.
Thank you very much. Very good news.
And when I was preparing, when I was coming to this consultation, this meeting, I was also thinking of how to approach this. What should be the approach where we understand oligarchy, democracy, were they always mutually exclusive? If you ask me, no. There are probably thoughts which says that oligarchy gives birth to democracy, democracy gives birth to oligarchy. You know, they feed into each other. A set of powerful people help in electing a powerful person, and closer to the throne, you play around your games, you manipulate, and again goes on and on and on. And we here keep talking about which came first. Now, since the 20s, since the robber barons, since many decades, we know how things have happened with a caucus around the throne, with the caucus around the power structure. Now, when we are talking about this, and why I'm suggesting that I bring in to the discussion the study of 2014 by the two professors, one from Princeton University and another from Northwestern University, who were convinced that US is an oligarchy. Now, I have followed this topic since probably 2005, because that was the time when we thought that with the new millennium, things will change. With the new millennium, we will think about development in a very holistic manner. We'll think about reaching out to the people. Now, when suddenly 2016, Christopher Bailey comes out, this famous whistleblower who comes out, who says that Cambridge Analytica actually played a major role in getting Mr. Trump to office. It was like a drama for us. We thought, really, can this happen? There were a couple of oligarchs who operated from Russia and a couple of oligarchs who came to US and directly got into Trump land, absolutely brazenly. So earlier, probably there was mob, and now probably there was Facebook and Twitter and all of this to manipulate people's thinking. So killing or eliminating people, or trying to work around their thoughts, or trying to work around their psychographics to see how we could influence them, was at a much deeper level. And then comes the fact that, look, we have to have our policies, because now we have elected you to power, you are there in the throne, now you have to do certain things because we want to profit. Hence, the same 1%, 2% people would control the rest. The same, the rest who are controlled would be struggling to get out, go out to the streets, talk loudly, be vocal, try to show their anger, try to resist, but always put down. And the same game continues. Now, why I'm saying this, Professor Jacobs, is because recently I had written about the woke capitalism, the new term that we're all using, woke capitalism. So when the civil society doesn't become active or gets into a slumber, rental economies, typically natural resources management driven economy, where you have easy money, supernormal profits, we tend to use that money, we tend to use those resources to play a much deeper, bigger, direct role in governance. And as we are talking, many states of our country are also going through this phase, including our state. So what happens is that you have a motley crowd of say 1 or 2% people who control all the resources, and hence the politics and business are actually the same. If you look at it from the lens of development, or from the lens of the person who's there on the street, they are the same. Because on one hand, we having a socialistic pattern or a historical thought, we think profit making is not good. We, as in some parts of the world, I'm not saying US, but profiteering is not good, or is bad, or is villainous. At the same time, we want the government to have resources, taxes, cess from profiting. Otherwise it becomes very difficult for the government also to operate. Now, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, three people control more than half, or more than almost all the bottom states economy of US. One half of US is equal to those, the resources controlled by these three people. So it's not about developing underdeveloping countries, but it's also about the economy of US, the politics of US, the society of US, to which we all look up to. We look up to US because even after saying all this, we think there is a dissenting voice there. We think there is a window of giving vent to your thinking, giving vent to your creativity, giving vent to your frustration or happiness or whatever. Even now we think that. Even now, after George Floyd, we still have hope in US. So it will be a great opportunity to hear from you. I have also followed your work. I know your thinking. I hope I know your thinking, and I know your ideology. So it will be really good to hear from you about a few things. We always think bribing is, the poor cousin of lobbying. No, when you bribe for little development work, you bribe at a lower level. When you lobby at the parliament, you lobby with the senators, you lobby at the Capitol Hill. So the kind of people who are getting into the lobbying industry is also a thing to study. They come with a typical, mindset, with a typical approach. So what is all this? What is all this? Is this all a nomenclature? Is this how we soothe ourselves by giving typical, definitions to lobbying, calling it, a power group, a pressure group, influencers, manipulative, things like this, or persuasive? I'm so persuasive. So if I'm like a salesperson, if I can sell you something, I can also sell you my idea. I can also sell you my profiting idea. What I would get if you do this for me, and then what you would get in turn. Maybe after your superannuation, you always get a job with the private sector. That has happened a lot in US. Top technocrats, bureaucrats are pulled in from the private sector, and the flow is two ways. They come here, people here go there. So it's very interesting. So when we have people like Deripaska or Agalarov or Weskelberg, these are the people whom we are naming them today because they are the people who were involved in 2016 elections. They were the people who were directly involved in manipulations to get Mr. Trump to office. Now, how brazen that could be, and what this results in, and what do we look forward to, are some of the things we would be happy to know from you, to hear from you, to share our thoughts with you. So we are so privileged, I would say, Professor Jacobs, to have you amongst us this evening, this morning, your time. And please tell us, please open the door to US. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good. Is it time to go on? Shall I begin?
Yes.
It's great to meet all of you. It's a privilege for me to see
Thank
you
you,
and to meet with
Mr.
you.
Bangladesh. Yes, yes.
You're freezing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. Please.
Okay. Shall I begin then? It's good to be here. Good to meet you, as I was saying. It's a privilege. I, as you know, live in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., in a state called Maryland, which is the realm of the Piscataway Indians. It's actually very interesting to see how names are used in this part of the country. Many of the names of rivers and locations are names derived from the Indian populations, the Native American populations, but many of the other sites still have the names of the Confederate soldiers who fought against the federal government. So it's a kind of contradiction. We have before us the reality of our Confederate institutions that still exercise power and exercise significance in the political system, as well as the evidence of some level of attention to those who were before us. I think the one thing that I contribute in general to this analysis, the one kind of idea that I have that's a little bit novel, is to look at American institutions as differentiated, to look at the country not as one thing, just as is relevant in any other context. Any other country must be viewed as something more than one thing, but the US, with its federal structure, multiple states, multiple traditions, cannot be appreciated as uniquely democratic or entirely oligarchical. There are institutions in conflict. And in a way, if you, in almost any country, and you can tell me if this is the case, any country, regardless of its democratic pretensions, if you peel away layers, go deeper into the history, you'll find the residual oligarchy or even the active oligarchy. So obviously we all have our ideas about what democracy and oligarchy are, but let me provide a little bit of background and raise questions, raise your hands, stop me if you want, because I want to be interacting with you. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint in a moment, but I want to hear from you. In the language of the founders, in the language of the great political theoretician Montesquieu, a French theoretician, who of course wasn't a founder of the US system, many of them talked about the idea of a mixed constitution. That is to say, a government that isn't entirely democracy, isn't entirely monarchy, isn't entirely aristocracy, but is a mixture. The US political system reflects those components because it has elements designed to reflect aristocracy. But as Aristotle himself said, aristocracy can devolve into oligarchy. And the US has been faced with an extraordinary struggle recently between oligarchical and democratic models. All of us, we must say, have been going through struggles and trials. But the US perspective on this is, like you, the pandemic, and also the issue of the survival of democratic institutions. I think we, in fact, have been on the precipice of changes in our system of government. And right now we're in a kind of stasis situation. So I'll give you my sense of the larger situation here. And I'm going to begin sharing content. First, can you hear me? And shall I go forward to the PowerPoint? Okay. I don't want to interrupt anyone. I want to hear from you. So shifting to the screen. Can you now see my screen?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me try again. Let's try this again. Maybe you should start sharing from your end. I'm having some difficulty. Start broadcast. No luck? Oh, okay. Let's see. Now, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Can you please confirm?
Yes.
Could you see the PowerPoint for a second? Okay. Okay. Tell me if you're not seeing this. Can you see it?
We can see it, but not. Okay. Now we can see it. It's
I'm going to
on.
go back to. It's okay. So maybe just be consistent. Can someone else from your end share my PowerPoint?
I guess so.
Rudra, you try. If you can do it.
Okay, good, because I'm not sure what's. I'm going to stop sharing.
Sir, just a second. You try to share the PowerPoint.
Yes, please do that.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether it was working or not. I can try
While-
one more.
Yes, while he's setting the PowerPoint, if you could go on, that will be good.
Pardon?
While he's setting the PowerPoint, if you could continue speaking.
Oh, okay, fine, great. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So, in the US, we have a federal structure, which of course is not unique to the US. But what is distinctive about it is the degree to which state governments have the power to define the politics of the state. In a way, when you think about the US, you could think about New York State and California and Florida, and every jurisdiction has a somewhat distinct flavor because obviously there's a different demographic distribution. There are different institutions as well. There is a large degree of differentiation in the way in which the states operate and reflect their citizens. Now, that very differentiation played a role in what happened in the US in January. On January 6th, when there were people at the Capitol asking for Biden not to be elected, they in fact reflected particular political jurisdictions where there had been something called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the shaping of a district to suit a particular political system, a political interest. So the most conservative representatives from those districts had very powerful positions because they never had to face pluralism, challenge from others in the way that might have generated a more democratic and robust outcome. So the nature of our institutions has reinforced, people call it polarization, but it's worse than polarization. There is what I would call a neo-Confederate infrastructure, which in this instance threatened to overcome the results of the democratic election. This is the slide in which I describe my location, the land of the Piscataway, and I mentioned that we have both the signs of our Confederate heritage as well as reflection of our Indian populations, Native Americans. Please continue. Next slide.
Next slide. Go to the next slide.
The people where the rivers blend.
After all these months of using Zoom, I still find the sharing of screens kind of troubling. So can you move to the next slide, please?
Can you move on? Some problem here, it seems.
Yeah, well,
Anyway, we can go on. I mean, I think
Yeah,
to negotiate.
right. So what happened on January 6th was the extremist, I would say, representing those very conservative forces in American society. Now, I call them neo-Confederate, and that might be an unfamiliar word. You know about the US Civil War and the struggle between the Union and the Confederacy. There are those who've been writing, and even those people, some of those people who participate have been writing about the neo-Confederate element. Those people who in a way would like to reestablish the old system in which there was much greater state discretion to maintain exploitative labor system. Now, people have debated what the causes of the Civil War were, but it really boils down to slavery and systems of servitude. So when you compare the state of Texas and New York and California and elsewhere across the country, what distinguishes those states is the degree to which they have pluralism and robust democratic practices. I would say that if you peel off layers of the US political system, you reach the neo-Confederate structure, which is the inner system that tends to reproduce conservative outcomes. Now, what is the goal of the neo-Confederate structure? The goal of the neo-Confederate structure is to disable the federal government as an agent of social change. This has been the goal since the Civil War. The Southern interests sought to preserve repressive labor practices, and they recognized that they could disguise those systems in the federal structure if they denied exposure and publicity. Two things happened to me in my youth that caused me to focus on this question of neo-Confederate structure. One, living in Bethesda, Maryland, around the time of the March on Washington, I encountered a young boy from Virginia who almost immediately tried to tell me a story about the inferiority of African Americans. This is the view he took with him from his home in Virginia initially. He also went to Virginia military schools, and he carried with him these attitudes which he sought to impose upon me, but I was resistant. I was not feeling inclined to divide the world into races as he did. And then later, when I was an undergraduate at University of Michigan, I had a professor who talked about, who opened my eyes about the state of Mississippi in the 1950s. And I discovered that Mississippi was in fact politically designed to generate stasis in race relations. The neo-Confederate structure was revealed in all its manifestations in Mississippi because there was only one party, the Democratic Party. It was a lily-white primary in which Democratic leaders were chosen. You couldn't talk about integration in Mississippi in the 1950s. Books about it were removed from the library, and you were subject to discipline by various paramilitary and political forces if you argued for integration. Now, the US in that period still was regarded as a democratic country, and yet it had within it states that reflected the most extreme oligarchies and repressive forces. So the experience of meeting this young guy from Virginia and my learning about the way Mississippi worked in the 1950s told me a lesson, which was embedded in the democratic institutions were very contrary structures in which oligarchies were much more powerful. So Mississippi is a lesson, and in a sense, it is precisely what the contemporary Trumpist faction of the Republican Party wants to reintroduce in some fashion on a national level. Let me get to the divisions among business interests. This is what I've focused on for a number of years. And this is partly about uncovering and revealing the truths about how business institutions differ. On the one hand, you have the traditional Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, which are the best known business lobbies. The Chamber of Commerce is reflected everywhere. You can find it in every city. But historically, the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers have been connected to this neo-Confederate heritage businesses that want to prevent the government from legislating minimum wages or labor standards. So it's interesting. There was an article written by an academic in the 1940s, or actually it was it might have been in the Harvard Business Review, in which he said the National Association of Manufacturers is positively a danger because of its sympathy for fascism. The idea is that, and this is what Robert Brady points out, a writer of the book, Business as a System of Power. He wrote that really there are two choices powerful business interests have. Do they accommodate challenge, or do they seek to repress challenge? Brady, B-R-A-D-Y, talked about the experience of Germany and Italy, where the big business interests accommodated themselves to authoritarian parties and distinguished those situations from elsewhere where business was in fact more moderate and inclined to deal with stakeholders. So there is this divide between accommodation and repression. The Chamber of Commerce and the NAM have historically been associated with the repression because they didn't want groups that would challenge business interests. They did not want an active regulatory state. So their primary goal was to kind of southernize America and make sure state governments would not be interventionist and disturb existing labor practices. That's on the one hand, you have the Chamber and the NAM, and those are old institutions. On the other hand, you had some other business groups that sought to increase dialogue. The first such group in the US context was the National Civic Federation around the early part of the 20th century. But these groups tend to be very fragile because on the one hand, the labor unions involved are pretty committed to bargaining. For the most part, they don't want to overrun the system and be totally dominant. So they're prepared to bargain. On the other hand, the business interests have this historic recollection of more authoritarian relations, and they don't tend to remain fixed on the more collaborative model. So you might look at the company like General Electric, which was in the 1930s an exemplar of cooperative labor relations, but in the 40s went hard right and in fact hired and mentored Ronald Reagan to be a leader of authoritarian politics in the US. So the National Civic Federation could not sustain this collaborative accommodationist approach to negotiation. It fell apart over the issue of immigration. Later in the 1940s, another group called the National Planning Association brought labor leaders and business leaders together. And it lasted for 50 years, actually, with some leading businesses prepared to go along with the idea that tripartism, collaboration, conversation can be good. But then even those business leaders grew weary of trying to entertain dialogue, and the National Planning Association pretty much faltered. So the NPA and the NCF are counterexamples. The Chamber of Commerce and the NAM are more traditional examples of the more authoritarian approach to business. And if you look at the documents produced by these organizations and their think tanks, you'll see that what they mean by democracy is something more highly constrained. They were interested in a political system that would not be unstable, that would not let large numbers of minority group members and others participate because that creates change. In the 1970s, it looks like we have some screen sharing about to start. In the 1970s, if you can advance the screen a few more slides, we get to the slide that mentions the American Legislative Exchange Council, a few slides down the way. The American Legislative Exchange Council is a new business lobby that was introduced, actually became more active and effective in the 1970s. But Lewis Powell, who was initially a Chamber of Commerce lawyer and later a Supreme Court justice, in a sense, told the country what the project was for these business interests. He said, American free enterprise is in danger. It is not going to survive. We have to fight all the challenges from universities, from intellectuals, from labor unions and the like. So Lewis Powell motivated philanthropists, wealthy people to put lots of money into new institutions. That's okay. That's one slide that talks about some of the problems of democracy in the US. But let's move on to the American Legislative Exchange Council a few slides down. So the American Legislative Exchange Council is an extraordinary organization. It's very imaginative. Unlike the more mainstream business lobbies, like the Chamber of Commerce and the NEM, the ALEC was all in on devising a more authoritarian system. So the way the American Legislative Exchange Council works is that business lobbyists and legislators meet together and they come to agreement, and then those agreements are turned into legislation. The American Legislative Exchange Council and allied groups have wanted to ensure that American politics would not permit social change. And they have become very dominant in particular state legislatures. And it is there, you may have heard about this, certain states are banning critical race theory in teaching. This is part of the effort of the American Legislative Exchange Council to alter the terms of debate. Critical race theory is something that law professors introduce. Basically, it's an argument that one should look behind institutions and see whether there is embedded racism limiting people's opportunities. And the ALEC and the other authoritarians on the right want to change the language and make it more difficult for us to perceive discrimination and exploitation. Next slide, please. There are many other think tanks and business lobbies associated with the neo-Confederate infrastructure. In addition to the American Legislative Exchange Council, there is something called Americans for Prosperity. And if you look behind these organizations, you find an extraordinarily small number of billionaires who are able to fund these organizations and alter politics. In fact, research done by ProPublica, which is a investigative journalism outfit, looked at the Chamber of Commerce and found that there were pretty much 40 billionaires who were making decisions for the organization. So despite the broad representation of the Chamber is very much in the orbit of the authoritarian right. When other business leaders challenge the authoritarian politics, this is a great slide, let me talk about this for a second. When other business leaders challenge this authoritarian politics, they're derided as prags, P-R-A-G-S. People say in the conservative business movement, you shouldn't compromise. But we've been deceived somewhat. American political scientist E.E. Schatzsnyder wrote happily that it was a great achievement of American democracy that the business had been forced to form a political organization to win elections rather than obstruct democracy. He wrote this in the 1950s, but it was premature. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. assured us that business had accommodated itself to the democratic state, but he was way too hopeful. He was writing in the New Deal era. Clearly, the federal structure allows business interests to be dominant on specific states and to acquire disproportionate representation in politics. And the think tanks on this side, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and their party in the courts, the Federalist Society, ask me about these organizations, there are many of them, but the Federalist Society and the ALEC have a vision of an ostensibly democratic system that will be primarily an opportunity for local oligarchs, local business interests to be dominant. So basically, the ALEC wants Walmart to dominate Arkansas, wants the growers to dominate California. They want systems in which the dominant business interests become the political leaders and are able to extinguish any challenges. Next slide, please. There's this constellation of business organizations, once again referring to Robert Brady, The difference is between the business groups that are open to compromise and those that are more authoritarian. Now, looking historically, just to answer the question about whether capitalism is compatible with democracy, it's interesting that democratic rights have been ordinarily the goal of lower status groups rather than established business interests. You don't see major businesses in being among the leaders of fights for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. It was skilled workers who were active among the Chartists in England and not necessarily the elite business interest. But something interesting is happening now that we will allude to. Given the Trump situation, there was a fragment of business that began to act, perhaps to preserve democracy. Next slide, please. So keep in mind the spectrum of business organizations divided by this issue of compromise or not. One of the extraordinary political battles of US history has been over universal health insurance. Universal health insurance, I think, symbolizes to conservative business interests the idea that government can do something for ordinary people and markets are not sacrosanct. So for years and years and years, a majority of Americans, according to polls, have been supportive of universal health insurance, but groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council and other of the Chamber of Commerce and the like have been determined to avoid any legislation on universal health insurance, and they're still fighting the Affordable Care Act. When you look at the perspectives of business leaders on democracy, you'll see that there has been this maybe significant but less influential faction of business groups who have said, we don't care that we may lose under democracy, but we value give and take, versus those businesses that are more inclined to provide forestall change. Joseph Schumpeter was a famous economist who called for his version of democracy, which was democratic elitism, in which the people would have some influence, but the elites would be dominant. James Buchanan, who was an economist and Nobel Prize winner, long associated with the right-wing think tanks, was interested in designing a constitution that would not permit majorities to challenge property rights. So we've had this continuing struggle. Next slide, please. The Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Legislative Exchange Council, to varying degrees have reflected the more conservative definition of democracy, which limits popular participation. What has happened recently is that groups like the ALAC have become more open about their desire to limit voting. And the Republican Party itself, in spite of its origins on the pro-union side of the Civil War, has become associated with the more conservative business interests. This whole controversy became first evident perhaps in the year 2000. In the year 2000, we had the Supreme Court rule in Bush versus Gore that the electoral count had to stop in Florida. And it was around that time that leading thinkers on the Republican side were wondering about whether they would face a very hostile future if minority groups voted in large numbers. They didn't like that in Florida, the immigrants were motivated to vote, and they were hoping that there would be enough slippage of those votes that the Bush would win on the Florida level. I don't know whether I need to tell you a little bit about the Electoral College, but that obviously is a peculiar institution that was designed to protect conservative employers and continues to make it more difficult for a simple majority to win elections. On the presidential level, we need to have a majority of electoral votes, which are votes determined by the states. And if a state is in the thrall of conservative interests, and people are not motivated to vote, that makes it more likely that a conservative movement can win in spite of a majority opposed to it. In the year 2000, Bush won the presidency by action of the Supreme Court, even though Gore had the majority on his side. So the Republican Party circles were increasingly focused on how to trim the vote. And this went back to the experience of the Southern Democrats who sought to keep African Americans from voting. It's the same model. If you can make it more difficult for people to vote, if minorities vote, if they're demobilized, if they vote in somewhat smaller numbers, then you can win a state government both in direct politics and in the Electoral College. Here, this slide indicates the influence of the Powell Memorandum and the Chamber of Commerce responsiveness to 40 donors. So actually it was, you'll see in a subsequent slide, if we can advance the PowerPoint, Hans von Spadowski was associated with the Heritage Foundation, another conservative think tank, and his whole reason for being has been to push the idea that unless we have limitations on the vote, there will be intense voter fraud. And voter fraud is the wrong people voting in their eyes, in the eyes of conservatives on this question. They're the wrong people, or people who are qualified, who are perhaps immigrants, who are perhaps undocumented. But if you look beneath the surface, it appears that they're just kind of concerned about wide voter participation to begin with. The Republican Party has become increasingly associated with this effort to limit the vote. Hans von Spadowski was the one who developed the strategy for the Republican Party at the Heritage Foundation. President George W. Bush tried to fire US Department of Justice attorneys who were not interested in prosecuting alleged voter fraud. And we were fully prepared, really, for Trump as a candidate to say that he could not lose unless there was voter fraud. So we have the crisis emerging in this sense with significant mobilization of minorities and others in 2016 and 2020. Trump would not be in the majority. He could only win if state governments were not open to wide-scale voting. In 2020, for a long time, Trump said that there was going to be voter fraud. He wouldn't win if there were, he would only lose if there were voter fraud. He was immediately poised as the election returns began to come in to say that there was an issue of voter fraud. And he had power over multiple nodes of the federal structure. That is to say, there were Republican leaders across the states. There were Republican members of Congress who were prepared to trumpet his claim that there was voter fraud. And therefore, we have a significant element of the Republican apparatus in the business community, it would appear, prepared to argue on behalf of Trump. Can we advance on the slides, please? I think I'm going to, let's turn off the PowerPoint altogether and just talk in real time here. So when you turn off the PowerPoint, please, let's return to the multiple screens so I can see your faces and say aye.
Mm-hmm. Rudra, stop sharing screen, no?
Yes, please.
Yes.
And I can get you a copy of the PowerPoint.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we had many established institutions prepared to continue on the line of arguing that voter fraud was the issue and that Trump really won. But the system is shaken up a little bit, and I'm thinking of writing a book about this, but I'm very interested in what actually happened that led to some new divisions. On the one hand, there were organizations representing the more reformist wing of business that were present and active. One was called Issue 1. Issue 1 was led by, among others, I think by this man has recently died, Amo Houghton, who'd been CEO of Corning. You may be aware of Corning Glass, a ceramic manufacturer upstate New York. He had been a liberal member of Congress, but a Republican, a little bit disturbed by the direction of Republican Party politics. But he was among those who began to organize among a fraction of business who said, we understand that regulation is a challenge to our interests, but we're not prepared to go along with those who would qualify democracy in the pursuit of business privilege. So there was Amo Houghton, among others. And very interestingly, it appears that a faculty member at the Yale University School of Management played a role in bringing together members of the Business Roundtable, which is another business lobby, much more concerned about prestige and public prominence. It represents the 100 biggest corporations, most valuable corporations in the US, very dominant corporations. And they were sensitive to this controversy and perhaps persuaded in part by this Yale University professor that they should not throw in their lot with Trump. So it was Jeffrey Sonnenfeld at Yale. But he was not the only professor to raise this alarm, these concerns. In both the Harvard Business Review and the Sloan Management Review, business academics like Ed Freeman and Rebecca Henderson and others said capitalism needs democracy. And in general, they were making this argument, but they were saying it with far greater energy and concern as Trump proposed to maintain power through the manipulation in Congress. So at the same time, the Republican members of Congress were saying that they were going to refuse to certify the Electoral College vote, claiming voter fraud. These business leaders in the Business Roundtable and at Yale and Harvard were saying, no, we don't want this to happen. We don't want there to be a repudiation of the democratic vote. And that means that we have a curious configuration of business interests in competition. Many of the long-established business lobbies susceptible to the authoritarian argument and possibly directly or indirectly supporting Trumpists. And then the fragment of other business leaders concerned about their reputation, not excited about a move towards authoritarianism, who publicly call for Trump Congress to respect the Electoral College vote. There was a very tense period in the US from the election itself to the aftermath of January 6th, when there was a great deal of spirited argument and business was divided in this significant way. It appeared that the Trump movement had conquered Republican Party institutions, but I think it's really, it has to do with the pressures business leaders feel and their sense of identity. Those who were loyal to the business lobbies were just about prepared to go all in on authoritarianism. Those who had their own personal reputations, who wanted to be perceived as philanthropists and leaders, were not prepared to see democratic institutions tarnished in that fashion. Apparently, it was a labor leader of the AFL-CIO who made some calls to various business leaders, and there was appropriate response from Harvard and Yale and some members of the Business Roundtable who got together and said, let's do what we can for election protection. And they put some pressure behind the scenes. Of course, there was also a great deal of other petition writing as the public, many elements of the public mobilized to call for a transition. But we were all pretty nervous. We were nervous because of the susceptibility to all these nodes of power to authoritarian manipulation. Now, based on my own research, I tend to see reformist business lobbies as very fragile and susceptible to the demands of the most conservative members of their organizations. I don't know what will happen in the future, whether or not there will be a reform faction in the Business Roundtable that will move toward more and more forceful support for democratic institutions. It may just be a flash in a pan in which those same CEOs, as they have in some cases, turn back to funding the most outrageous Republicans. But I would imagine the part of what democracy depends upon in the US is that some fraction of business is prepared to break with the authoritarian system and deny the legitimacy of the neo-Confederate system. I've said a whole bunch of things. I'm sorry I've had problems with the PowerPoint, but let me open it up here and maybe I can clarify what I've been getting at, help illuminate two things. One, the differentiation in US institutions that gives authoritarians opportunities for control, as well as the lay of the land of business lobbies and their contrary philosophies. I have a question coming from Bikram. And the question was, let me read it now. What is the role of intellectual people to strengthen American democracy, rather prompting capitalism agendas, your ideas on it, and critical thinking about beyond pandemic business? I think that what ultimately changes business lobbies and particular businesses is mobilization of everyone else. And I borrowing language from labor history, I call that upheaval. When people vote and they organize and they're vocal, then business leaders begin to realize that they have to change their tune. The whole corporate social responsibility movement was in part because people were pushing business to change. I think that what is critical in all of this is whether in the US, intellectuals and others can fight and insist upon the right to vote. That fundamental principle, however strange it seems that we have to argue for it, that is the crux. In the US, we don't have a constitutional right to vote. The framers of the Constitution wanted to leave that to states in a way that privileged particular business interests. The Voting Rights Act provided great impetus for voting rights, but it wasn't a constitutional right, and the Supreme Court undermined the Voting Rights Act by saying that states would not have to have their voting practices examined for in terms of discrimination. So if we can, on a state level and on a federal level, protect voting rights, here's a really interesting riddle. In the Senate, as you know, the filibuster means the minority can frustrate the rule of the majority. Right now, there are bills to protect voting rights that would increase federal control over the states, because the states are the location where voting rights are qualified. So in order to win new legislation that guarantees voting rights, we need to actually suspend the filibuster and allow a simple majority to win that legislation. If that does not happen, then the states will continue to be laboratories of repression. So I think the one objective of intellectuals right now, people who write, people who think, should be to clarify what democracy is and how it depends upon people participating, so that some of the false language of voter fraud and the embedded racial resentment can be challenged by insisting on people's rights. So we need to get engaged in the struggle for voting rights, because that will determine what happens in politics and will also have impacts on the character of our businesses because they will be compelled to change their tune. Thank you for that question. Any more questions? I'm sure that that I'll be able to get my PowerPoint to you so you can look at it in your leisure. I should say something about how this relates in the US to COVID. You probably have read about how around the world, COVID has been wrapped up in political argumentation. The neo-Confederate side of the COVID controversy has diminished the danger of the illness. And they've been very resistant to the policies that might be required to stop this. There was a big battle between the city of Houston, where there are lots of people of color, and the state government over whether or not to engage in lockdowns. If you look at a map of the country, you'll see that certain states, the Northeast and Midwest and West, organized collectively on COVID policy, and the more conservative southern states were much more lax about that. In fact, they seem to be embracing a kind of social Darwinist philosophy. This argument might be familiar to you. And it was Samuel who asked, what is the alternative of oligarchs in politics? An oligarch, of course, is a person in the elite who wants to exercise disproportionate power, whereas an accountable and responsible leader or activist is the alternative, someone who does not condescend toward others. Embedded in the neo-Confederate organizations is this sense that there are people who are lesser, that there are people who aren't entitled to govern. And of course, if you concede the argument that some people don't have the right to govern, then even you will lose power to those who have the opportunity to impose their will upon you. So a mobilization of voters and citizens asking for accountable institutions is what limits oligarchy and gives us moments of democracy.
Professor Dravid, I have a question. If organizers have no problem, I can one question. Myself, Professor Palita from Central University of Odisha. Is it audible?
Pardon me, can I hear you?
Yes. You see
Yes,
that I have a question. Mr. Guru Prasad, is it audible and can I ask a question?
Yes, of
sir.
course.
Yes, sir. You can go on.
Yes. Yes. You see, in another 30 to 50 years, how do you visualize the relationship of America, whom the whole world look as a democratic setup, that when things are changing in the world and China is emerging in this part of the world and America has business interest all over the world, including China, India, etc., and major part of Asia, how do you visualize the relationship in another 30 to 50 years and how it will have an impact on American system itself, democratic system itself?
Well, of course, I've been arguing that America has a pretty complicated system and that are parts of it that are democratic and parts of it that are oligarchical. And I would like, for my safety and for the safety of others in the world, for the US to become a more accountable country that listens to its own citizens and listens to other countries as well. There are challenges. Trump revealed to us that there was a ready coalition of authoritarian leaders around the world who would be prepared to work together. And the challenge is, I hope, to build democracy both internally and more internationally by alliances of democratic forces that will attempt to confront some of the grave issues like we have, like public health issues and climate change and the like, the oligarchs in their governments around the world tend to be less concerned about those facts of illness on the ground. Now, no country should presume to be a leader of the world. We should all seek to live in the world and fashion instruments of collective security. I think that the world is a little bit safer with Trump off the stage, but we don't know. He claims he will have a chance to be reinstated in August. And it's interesting, we haven't talked directly about the role of propaganda, but apparently there are people who respond very easily to abusive language because they feel is somehow familiar and are prepared to embrace a tyrant. But I think that the analog internationally of a democratic responsive system is more collective security and diplomacy. I'm not sure if that gets it. I don't have a solution for China. China is very powerful. We must be able to cooperate with China as well as to challenge it on certain internal practices.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I come in, Professor Jacob, for a minute?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm open for any questions. Go ahead.
Very interesting. I mean, the three aspects that really struck to me as you spell it out. One is that you said there is a increasing tendency of, on the part of the elements who constitute that, business lobby, that there has to be a kind of marriage between capitalism and democracy. I flag off this point. And then second, you said that there is a crack which is emerging within this business lobbies, and one strand of it would go in favor of democratic norms and everything, opposing authoritarian tendencies. And then again, very interestingly, you also referred to this idea of climate, climate issue. What has been troubling me in the last couple of years is the question of climate, climate justice. The whole agenda has not yet been very strongly structured because we had this 5 years of Trump regime and pandemic, and which in certain ways has made America, I think, to my understanding, has made America inward looking than looking outside. So, do you think that the trajectory that has really preceded us in the recent past has, kept this issue of climate under the carpet to a certain extent, and it's not picking up? I mean, the momentum it should have taken up by now, it hasn't been so visible, it has remained invisibilized. Is that so? How do we address this question of climate justice? And what is those demotic elements, not democratic, the demotic element, the populist elements? What is their take on this?
Well, I think that the democratic movements around the world are more sensitive to the effects of runaway capital development on their communities. So they've been developing a consciousness of this concept of environmental justice and climate justice. But at the same time, there are the oligarchs who are quite prepared to put themselves in peril by failing to act, because they maybe out of a sense of arrogance and confidence that they can protect themselves in their own gated communities. So we have something very painful on our side, which is that anybody who looks at the world around us will see increasingly that there are changes issuing, that there are climate issues. And maybe if they can begin to see the relationship between their own dangers and perils and the dangers and perils of others, we'll be able to forge a larger movement across nations the Biden administration is providing an opportunity here. But if we, at the same time, don't fight for voting rights in this country, then we'll lose that opportunity because the oligarchical interests really have such a sense of short-term development that they will fritter away the planet. So the one project I've mentioned is the emphasis of the importance of emphasizing democratic rights. Another project that we almost focus on is clarifying reality. We have seen through Cambridge Analytica and other organizations an enormous efforts to confuse the public about what the dangers are. So part of the requirements of public hygiene are to limit the propaganda and expose the reality of the dangers we face. It looks like got some questions, and I have quite a yes. Subha,
I have a question. The ensuing danger. Yes, the ensuing danger to the 21st century world is the manipulated data of the infotech world that has less importance so far as the objective truth is concerned. So in the post-truth political world order, emotions are playing the pivotal role in shaping the voting behavior and the mindset of the people. It is very difficult to understand whether the voters' turnout in the elections of the democratic countries like India and the US are the manifestation of their free will or the byproduct of their manipulated will. What will be the future of our new generation in the post-truth political order? So can you please briefly summarize it?
Yes, thank you for that. You're talking about very worrisome developments, and I mean, it's a problem for the concept of democracy that large numbers of people can be persuaded to act against their own interests, and that very pernicious doctrines can become dominant. In a sense, we have to think about how one persuades others, how one persuades someone that there's greater opportunity in cooperation than in abuse and conflict. I think of what comes to mind is all sorts of fables and movies and dramas about someone who's been reduced to evil by his circumstances, but there's still some potential for him or her to be redeemed. In the case of the US, there are large numbers of people in declining industrial areas who have been sick by virtue of losing their jobs and have been addicted to opiates and the like, and yet they thought that choosing hate was a better solution for them than cooperating with immigrants and others. So we can't just surrender to the post-truth environment. We do in fact have to engage and figure out what are the dynamics by which patent falsehoods are able to captivate people and motivate them to act against their own interests. There's been a lot of study about this historically, but we need to revisit the problem and see how we can persuade people to engage in democratic cooperation. Thank you for that question. And there was someone else asking, Milan asked generally, can we separate business and politics and democracy? I would say that that oligarchy is a perversion of business and politics, because within business organizations and organizations of all kinds, there are legitimate interests, and they need to be able to engage in politics rather than to seek total control. The danger of oligarchs is that they close people out within business and elsewhere. So if we can build more pluralistic institutions, we can build democracy in business as well as business in democracy. Hope that got some of the questions. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Professor David. If any participants have any other questions for, please ask. Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Samuel Lima for going for the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Dr. Samuel Lima.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Rudra, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Lima.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes,
Thank you.
well, yes. On behalf of all the participants and the Center for Adivasi Research and Development and Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput, I extend my deep sense of gratitude to you, Professor Jacobs, for accepting our invitation to be here in this digital platform. Professor David Jacobs, I thank you so much for you joined us all the way from Maryland, United States, and you also enlightened us in this topic, business and politics in the United States, oligarchy or democracy. So in this program, the World Human Sciences and Management Conferences, the topic of the particularly this title of this conference is AGNOTOLOGICAL Context, Disciplinary Practices and Social Science and Knowledge. I thank to all the participants and patrons like Professor Mahadev Deshwal, Director, IIM Sambalpur, Professor I. Ramarama, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and convener of this meeting, Professor Chandri Prasad Nanda and Mr. Charudat Panigai. Really, we are thank you so much for joining us and giving your precious time in this program. And also, I thank Professor Sarat Kumar Palitra, the professor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput. And also, I thank to all the technical assistants or coordinators of this program, Subham Das, Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Dhanasyam Giri, Rudra Narayan Das, Chinmay Kumar Sahu. And also, I thanks to all the students, researchers, teachers, professors, and academics of the IIM Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, and Ravenshaw University. And also, I thank to all the participants like Dr. Priyadar Sikara, Dr. Nidhita Mahanti, Dr. Tirtha Prakash Jana, and Dr. Subhash Chandra Bari, the General Secretary of Odisha History Congress. And also, finally, I thank to Dr. Vikram K. Sijana, a person who gathered all of us in this digital platform. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much and being with us. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I want to give you my email address in case anybody wants to continue the conversation, dcjacobs@american.edu. And I've enjoyed this very much. I wish that we could get together and have some coffee or something, but we can have email.
Thank you.
Thank you to
much.
all the sponsors.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening. I hope you have a nice dinner soon.
A great day also for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your precious time.